evening and welcome to our Waltham Public Library program, Tuscan Wine Tour and Tasting with Gordon's Wine. My name is Deborah Hoffman and I organize programs and events for the library. Thanks for tuning in. Before we start, I want to let you know how the evening will go. Our speaker will do a 30 to 40-minute talk and then she'll field questions. To ask questions via the chat function, use a Google account to sign into YouTube, and feel free to write your question at any time, and then I'll read them at the end of the presentation. Chelsea Bell is a certified sommelier at Gordon's Wine in Waltham. Over to you, Chelsea.
Thank you so much, Deborah. And it's so exciting to be here with you all, patrons of Waltham Library. Once again, my name is Chelsea Bell. I run events and marketing for Gordon's Wine. We're based out in Waltham on 894 Main Street, but also have 4 other locations in the Boston area. And I run events and marketing, and also I'm a certified sommelier. And Italy is one of my favorite wine regions in the entire world. So we're going to have so much fun tonight going through a tour of Tuscany and going into 2 specific wines, or 2 specific styles of wines. White wine called Vernaccia di San Gimignano, and a red wine called Vino Nobile di Montepulciano. And of course, at the end, you can ask some questions and we'll just have a great time. I want this to be fun and exciting. And what I found in my time working in wine is that Italy can be very complex when it comes to wine. The reason being, you have 20 different wine regions to work with, and you have hundreds and hundreds of different indigenous grape varietals. So you might hear of grapes tonight that you're unfamiliar with, and that's totally okay. That's part of the fun of Italian wine, in my opinion. And we're going to the region that really is kind of the creme de la creme of Italian winemaking, Tuscany. So we talked about 20 different wine regions. Tuscany is definitely one of the most popular, most high profiled, and makes some of the most fantastic and expensive wines in all of Italy. So we'll talk through that too. Before we get into the wines, just a little quick history about Tuscany and winemaking, because it's great to kind of get situated. First of all, Tuscany is going to be right just north of Lazio in central Italy. Lazio is where Rome lies on the map, and it's right in between Lazio and then the region of Liguria, which is where the Cinque Terre kind of Italian coastal Riviera falls on the map. So central Italy with inland and coastal regions. And winemaking there is some of the oldest in terms of Italian history. It goes back 3,000 years, if you can imagine. So they've been doing this for a while, and they have really perfected it, I believe. It goes back starting with the Etruscans, who brought vines over from Asia and parts of the Middle East, and worked hard to kind of create and cultivate these vines. And then once the Middle Ages started, you had more vines being planted because of Christianity, because of course wine was used for sacred purposes. And the Renaissance then brought some of the most kind of classic Tuscan figures, such as the, of course, Medici family, who's a famous, very wealthy family of Italy, who also helped kind of make sure that there was tons of viticulture happening, and they also started to trade Tuscan wine and Italian wine outside of Italy. And it became very popular, and Chianti was that first style of wine, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that was traded outside of Tuscany and was a huge hit and really kind of got people excited about Italian wine. With the Renaissance bringing all of this trade, kind of everything was looking up, but then World War II came and actually decimated a lot of Italian vineyards all throughout Tuscany, and especially northern Italy. There were a lot of vineyards that were burned, or the vines were left unattended, and a lot of actually winemakers of that time had lost so much money. They had lost like their entire income from this. So a lot of them actually fled Tuscany and Italy and came to the US and different parts of the world. So there was a little kind of window between, I'd say, the 1930s and 1960s where there wasn't as much happening in Tuscany. And in the 1960s, you found that people started coming back to tend to the vineyards. A lot of family-owned wineries where the family had stuck around had come back to kind of rework the vines and like revitalize the industry, which was very exciting. And from there, Tuscan wines kept on growing and growing. Actually, in the 1960s, there were 2 wines that were finally given what's called DOC status, which is one of the highest statuses one can achieve in Italian wine. And that was Chianti, which was one of the first, a Tuscan red wine, which we'll talk about, and then Vernaccia di San Gimignano, a white wine, which we'll also chat about this evening. So Tuscany was kind of at the forefront of some of these really well-known Italian wines coming out to the international market. And I've seen ever since kind of the 1960s, you know, a lot of great production of Tuscan wines. Chianti was obviously the wine that really propelled Tuscan wine, but there's so many other different styles that are becoming more and more prominent. The Vino Nobile di Montepulciano, which we'll feature tonight, which we'll chat about. And then, of course, you might have heard of a term called Super Tuscans before, which is a style of red wine coming from the coast of Tuscany in an area called Bulgari, and is typically actually made from a blend of different grape varietals that are actually non-indigenous to Italy, such as Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon, and sometimes too Cabernet Franc or Syrah. So what I'll do at this point, I'm going to share my screen and just show you a map, because I think getting geographically situated can make life so much better, so we can all know exactly where we are. So give me one sec. And all right, cool. Deborah, do you want to give me a thumbs up that you can see my screen? Okay. All righty. Okay. So with this map of Tuscany here, I'm just going to get you all situated with where you're at. Once again, in between Lazio and Liguria in central Italy. You have here some of the most classic Italian wine regions. And while there's a lot of things on this map, we're only going to focus on a couple tonight because they're the ones that I think are most prominent. So you have to the north, Chianti. The Chianti zone is definitely one of the most well-known areas within Tuscany. It's going to stretch all the way down from Florence to Siena, and it involves the most classic kind of style of wine of Tuscany, which is called Chianti. So you might be wondering, what exactly does she mean, Chelsea, mean when she talks about Chianti wines? Chianti is always going to be a red wine, and it comes from the most classic grape varietal of Tuscany, which is Sangiovese. So Sangiovese makes over 60% of plantings for Tuscany. And as we'll kind of talk about tonight, it has a lot of different iterations depending on where you're coming from and what part of Tuscany you're at. So Chianti's wines are made up of typically around 75 to 80% minimum Sangiovese. And then they can blend in other varietals. There's a couple white grapes that can be blended in small quantities. They sometimes just amp up the aromatics a little bit. And then there are red grapes such as Canaiolo, which is an indigenous varietal, Merlot, a varietal from France, originally from Bordeaux. And then also too, a grape called Mamolo, which we'll chat about a little later, another indigenous Italian varietal. So Chianti is always going to be a blend. You'll notice in the middle, there's this, in orange, there's the region of Chianti Classico, which is the heartland. When you see Classico in a region for Italian winemaking, it usually will just indicate that it is the kind of classic area for production. And then there's other areas that stem from that. So such as Chianti Colli Fiorentini or Chianti Colli Senese, there's about 5 different subregions outside of the Chianti Classico zone. And each of them usually have their own aging requirements and have some subtle differences, though they are using the majority Sangiovese in the blend. You'll also find too, one of my favorite regions in the Chianti zone, which is called Gimignano. You can see it just up to the west of Florence, just a bit to the west, and it's very small. But it's Sangiovese that can be blended in with a little Cabernet Sauvignon, sometimes a little Merlot, and it can have a little bit more heft to it. One of my definitely favorite regions in Tuscany, besides what we'll be tasting tonight, the Vino Nobile. And then you have to the coast, you have Livorno. So Livorno is going to be coastal Tuscany. It's actually most well known for these super Tuscan style wines that I was talking about earlier, as the majority of Tuscan wines are red wines. Once again, you'll see the regions below Livorno, Bulgari and Suveretto, which are two of the most famous, and where a lot of these super Tuscan producers lie on the map. So Super Tuscans, a classic kind of example would be if you've ever heard of Ornellaia or Sassicaia. These are two kind of classic Super Tuscan producers, and some of these Super Tuscan wines can run to like $100 to $200+ a bottle, so they can get really expensive. They were more of kind of a, a Italian way of making Bordeaux-like wines, Bordeaux-like blends. In the Bordeaux region of France, the blends are typically Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot-like, and they found that the coast of Tuscany was somewhat similar to the climate in Bordeaux. So it was a reaction to that, and Super Tuscan wines are still somewhat controversial in Italy. And the reason being is because a lot of Italians love to focus on their indigenous grape varietals. These classic grapes such as Sangiovese, the grape Vernaccia, which we'll talk about earlier. But sometimes these grapes such as Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon can be a little frowned upon because they're non-indigenous. And some Italians are really passionate about just using their own grape varietals. As we also too work down the Chianti region, back in orange, you will see two very classic towns, one of which we'll talk about tonight, the town of Montalcino and then the town of Montepulciano, two towns that also work with Sangiovese. So if you're having red wine from Tuscany, just as a reminder for the future, you're most likely having Sangiovese in its different iterations. In the town of Montalcino, the most classic wine, which is one of the most expensive wines of Tuscany, is Brunello di Montalcino. And Brunello is just a local name for the Sangiovese grape varietal, a local name for the clone. Brunello translates to brown one, as it has a little bit of a brownish kind of tint to it, the grape varietal itself. And then in Montepulciano, which we'll chat about when we visit the Tenuta di Gratiano wine later, we have also 100% Sangiovese typically in a lot of the wines, but there it's referred to as Prunello Gentile. So you'll find, once again, Sangiovese has some different little names depending on the like slightly different clonal differences between the grape from here to here. Because if you think about it, if you take a grape, it's the same grape, and plant it in a different place for a long period of time, it's going to take on maybe some minute differences over time, some like slight mutations. So while like these are all Sangiovese grapes, there's some like subtle differences to them that kind of make them unique in that area. And then lastly, just right at the bottom of Tuscany is Grosseto, another area that doesn't get a lot of love, but I think there's some great wines here. And I visited this area several years ago. And one of my favorite wines from the area, if you want to try a new style of Sangiovese, is called Morellino di Scanzano. It's actually right next to where the little pointer is for Grosseto. And Morellino, as you guessed it, is another clonal name or varietal of Sangiovese. So it's just Sangiovese coming from Scanzano. So when you see D, it means from. So fun stuff. Brunello di Montalcino, Brunello coming from Montalcino. Vino Nobile de Montepulciano, Vino Nobile coming from Montepulciano. So that's part of the fun. So I wanted to kind of just highlight that, get you all situated, and then let's start talking about these wines. I'm going to stop sharing here. So give me a second. And all right. All righty. Okay, I'm back. Awesome. Okay, so I hope to, I'm just going to say this, and I didn't say it before, so my apologies. I want to make sure you're drinking your wines. You can totally start drinking them now if you'd like, because this is a wine tasting. It should be fun. So if you do have our first wine, the Sono Montenidoli Vernaccia di San Gimignano, and you're not drinking it already, I recommend just pouring some in your glass and getting ready, because we're going to chat about it. Okay. So we have two different wines that I wanted to spotlight tonight. And when I was thinking about what wines to pick, I thought about some of my favorite vineyards. And with Gordon's, we love to focus on smaller production wineries. While we carry a vast, ginormous range of different wines from all over and a lot of well-known brands, my love and passion is definitely working with some of these smaller, more artisanal vineyards. And you really find that there's just such great craftsmanship with these wines, and they really speak to their sense of place. Because for me, Italian wine is really about showcasing some of these amazing places that make these wines really unique. So I wanted to start first with a white wine from Tuscany. As I mentioned, Tuscan wine is predominantly red and predominantly from Sangiovese, which we'll get into, but the most classic white wine of Tuscany, and probably one of the top white wines of Italy, comes from Tuscany. So I'm going to go over the first producer, which is Sono Montenidoli. There's a wine here called Fiore, which I'm going to go over, but one or two of you might have gotten another wine from them called Tradizionale, which I'll go over as well, which are very similar. So Sono Montenidoli is a producer from San Gimignano. So San Gimignano is just this beautiful little walled-in medieval hill town that's right in the central part of Tuscany, right in that Chianti zone. And it is known for the style of white wine called Vernaccia di San Gimignano. So we had talked about the fact that D means from. Vernaccia is the grape varietal. It's spelled Vernaccia. And what's so interesting about this grape is, and this is where Italian wines can get a little wild, is Vernaccia actually technically means kind of to come from. So there are actually like tens to 20 at least different types of Vernaccia wines all throughout Italy. And they're all different grapes technically, but they're all called Vernaccia. And I remember when I first traveled to a couple different wine regions, I found this extremely confusing. And this is where Italian wine can sometimes be a little challenging. So I usually, when I'm referring to Vernaccia, we'll usually refer to it as Vernaccia di San Gimignano, because this is the specific grape coming from San Gimignano. So this is a wine that is amazing little white wine, actually one of the first white wines, as I mentioned, to achieve what's called DOC status. When we're talking about Italian kind of classifications for wine, I'll quickly go over this because I think it's always helpful. There's 4 different levels of classification. There's what's called like a VDT, which is your entry level table wines. VDT stands for Vino da Tavola. What it does is it gives winemakers the opportunity to blend grapes from different regions. They kind of have the ability to do whatever they want in terms of winemaking. And it's typically only reserved for, you know, some of these very simple wines that you find that are very reasonably priced, and they're not doing minimum aging requirements or anything wild and crazy. Then your next level up is what's called Indicazione Geografica Tipica, or IGT wines, which will typically just have the region on the front of the label. So it could be any one of those 20 different Italian wine regions. And it gives them still some flexibility within that region of what they're planting and what they're working with, but it's a little bit of a stricter kind of classification. And then at the tippity top, you have your 2 highest levels of classification. DOC, which stands for Denominazione Origine Controllata, and then DOCG, which both of the wines we're featuring tonight have, which have this beautiful little seal. And DOCG means, the G means garantita. So it's the highest level of classification. And when you get to those 2 levels, the DOC and DOCG, they're usually representing a smaller sense of place, like a smaller specific land area. And there's specific mandatory grapes that must be planted, specific yields of the grapes that they can grow, sometimes aging requirements. It gets stricter because at the end of the day, as you work to the top of the period, you're trying to kind of represent this sense of place. So when we see this DOCG wine with the little label up top for Vernaccia di San Gimignano, if you wanted to plant Chardonnay, say, in this vineyard like that you had, and you wanted to make a 100% Chardonnay wine, you could not classify it as Vernaccia di San Gimignano. It has to come from a minimum 80% Vernaccia And then you can blend in just a couple other grape varietals. Certain producers might use a little Chardonnay or Sauvignon Blanc, or sometimes indigenous grapes such as Trebbiano, but overall Vernaccia is really the star. And there's kind of stricter standards that you have to follow, and you have to submit your wine to the kind of governing body to make sure that it's kind of within the guidelines. So it gets strict. Italy doesn't always play by the rules, but with wine they do, which is great. So Sono Montenidoli is one of these small producers that I love. I love also like, you know, supporting women in winemaking. I always think that that like brings me a lot of joy being a woman myself in the industry. And this is a winery founded in 1965 by founding winemaker Elisabetta Fagioli. And she's still kicking it, still part of the vineyard with her family, and makes just these really interesting, wonderful wines. She does a couple different levels of Vernaccia. She does 3 different classifications. It starts off with the Tradizionale, which has a green label, then the Fiore, which I have right here, white label, and then it's not available in Massachusetts, but she makes one level up called the Curato. And I'll explain the difference between each one. The entry-level Tradizionale, she actually uses, this sounds weird, but she actually takes the skins of the white grape and lets them soak with the juice for a certain period of time, which gives the wine a little bit of this like hint of a goldeny orange hue, which was actually a classic way of like making Vernaccia di San Gimignano back in the day. That's referred to now as like an orange wine. You might have heard this term before. It's when a winemaker chooses to take the white grapes skins and let them soak for a period of time with the juice. As the majority of white wines just take a white grape, press them, let the juice come out, and then choose their aging vessel. So this is kind of taking that extra step and giving a little bit of skin contact, which gives a little more tannin, a little more color. The Fiore, which I have here, is just the free run juice. So there's no skin contact here. And both the Tradizionale and the Fiore are aged using stainless steel as opposed to oak aging. The highest level up is called the Curato, which does use a little oak. I've noticed that some producers from Vernaccia di San Gimignano have started using a little oak aging with their Vernaccia wines, which I'm, to be honest, not a huge fan of. For me, it's a little bit more of a delicate grape, and I think it does better with stainless steel aging. Once again, stainless steel is just going to let that grape's natural personality shine through, and it's not going to add any secondary flavors or aromas. It's going to let it kind of do its thing. And let's taste the wine together. I'll say too, before I do that, that another thing that I love about Elisabetta's wines from Sono Montenidoli is that she not only uses like organic farming, but also uses biodynamic farming principles. So you might not have heard that term before, but biodynamic basically takes organic farming a step further, and it's a more holistic approach to farming, which was founded by an Austrian philosopher named Rudolf Steiner, in the early, I think around the 1920s, 1930s. And the biodynamic principles use like, you know, they look at the vineyard as being an ecosystem. And so they're doing everything that they can with the land to make like those vines grow the best that they can. So when she originally came to the vineyard, she brought in earthworms to till the soils. She brought in rabbits so that she could use like their manure to like fertilize the soil. So just using your surroundings to make a better wine. And we're all about that. And two, when you're drinking these wines too, I think you can taste the difference, not only in quality, but I think in how you feel the next day. I'm always a fan of like, you know, organic wines or wines that are not made with a lot of heavy hand in terms of the winemaking process. So in terms of tasting, when I'm tasting wine, I'm going to go over kind of what I'm getting out of it, but I by no means ever believe that like what I, you know, always say is the 100% right way of doing things, because I look at tasting as everybody has a unique, you know, we're all brought up in different ways. We're all going to experience the wine a little differently. And especially in terms of like tasting notes, we'll get things that are sometimes a little bit different, and that's okay. So never ever feel like if I say something that like, you know, if you're not getting it, then you're wrong, because it's actually quite the opposite. We're all right in terms of like what we think, and we're all kind of going along this journey together. So when I initially like look at the wine, I actually sometimes can get a lot out of just like sight. For white wine, sometimes you can actually tell a couple things from just looking at the wine. You can tell by sometimes the fact that it's a little bit lighter in color, that it's not been treated with oak, as oak aging can sometimes give you some deeper color. Also, too, warmer climate can give you much deeper color. So it might also indicate too, if it's more of this like straw kind of goldeny color, that it's from a more, a little bit of a cooler climate, or not a climate that's too warm. So you can tell a lot by sight. When I stick my nose in the glass, I'm automatically happy, of course. But the thing that jumps out, I'd say first to me, are these really beautiful kind of like appley notes, definitely like citrus that comes through as well. And Vernaccia is known for sometimes having a little bit of this like bitter almond note on the nose as well. And these like subtle like white floral qualities too. Oh, so refreshing. I hope everybody chilled this down today, because it was a hot one. We really needed that. So when I'm tasting the wine too, I love to think about, like with white wines, how the acidity is well balanced in the wine. Acid's going to bring you some lift in the wine. And while acid or acidity might sound like a kind of negative term, it might sound like abrasive. When I refer to acidity, it's, you know, it's the lift of the wine. It's what like brings the wine alive, in my opinion. So I always love white wines that have well integrated acidity, and this kind of hits me right away. And it just kind of like covers my tongue in just like refreshing qualities, which I just love. I can also tell too, so they used, with this specific wine, the Fiore, they used what's called like lees contact here, which is when you take the dead yeast cells of the wine and you like stir them. It's a process called batonnage, and it will tend to add a little bit more texture, sometimes a little bit of this like toastier note in the wine that can be quite nice and adds a little texture without having to add oak. So there's a little lees contact here, which is quite lovely. And overall, this is just a real joy. Like throughout the summertime, what I love about this wine is it's so versatile in terms of food pairings. Definitely a great wine to do with like any type of chicken dish, especially any type of chicken that's like more of kind of a citrus or herbaceous chicken dish. It's a great wine to do, especially with any like white fish dish or seafood. Really lovely. And also too, can stand up to a lot of like white sauce or like kind of green sauce based like pasta dishes as well. But I always find when you find these like white wines that are not too aromatic with too many like crazy aromatic qualities and are not aged in oak, they're stainless steel aged, so they're refreshing. There's just, the sky's the limit in terms of pairings here. So definitely something that makes me really happy. I hope for anybody that got to taste this tonight, you all enjoyed it as well. I'm going to go into our second wine. I'm going to take you from the hill town of San Gimignano, and we're going to go just a little southeast. We're going to go to the town of Montepulciano. So here's where things get confusing. So I have here the 2017 Vino Nobile de Montepulciano from the winery Tenuta di Gracciano della Setta. So getting a little confusing here, because this is coming from the village of Montepulciano, but the grape is Prunello Gentile, which, as I mentioned, is a clone of the most prominent grape of Tuscany, Sangiovese. So the confusing thing is here, there's also a grape varietal called Montepulciano, which many of you I'm sure have had before, but that comes typically from Abruzzo, or Abruzzo, which is in the eastern part of Italy, right on the Adriatic side. So if you've had Montepulciano d'Abruzzo, that means it's Montepulciano coming from Abruzzo, whereas this is Vino Nobile de Montepulciano, which comes from the village of Montepulciano, which is in Tuscany, but it's the grape is Sangiovese or Prunello Gentile. So that's where another Italian fun fact there. They love to confuse you. And they're very different grapes, both great grapes, but definitely different. So I know when I first got into the wine industry and was trying to tackle Italian wine, that was challenging for me. But I find that this is a wonderful area of value. As I mentioned, there's the town to the east, Montalcino, which makes one of the most, one of the more expensive wines of Tuscany, Brunello di Montalcino. This is just to the east, and I think the wines tend to be half the price, and they're very good. So I'm always a huge fan of like finding value in Italy. There's so many places to find it, and this is one of them. So Tenuta di Gratiano is actually one of the oldest wineries in Montepulciano. They started in the early 19th century, and they're family owned by the Della Setta family, and just another just like rock star producer. They make 3 different styles of wine from this area, which is very typical for wineries from Montepulciano. They make what's called a Rosso di Montepulciano. The next level up that we'll talk about tonight is the Vino Nobile di Montepulciano. And then the like top tier is a Vino di Montepulciano Reserva. So as you work your way up the chain here, with the Rosso di Montepulciano being DOC and the Vino Nobile, Montepulciano and Reserva being DOCG. The only differences you're going to find with those 3 wines are the aging requirements. As you work your way up the chain, each one is aged for a longer period of time before release. And sometimes to the Vino Nobile di Montepulciano and then the Reserva version will come sometimes from older vines. A lot of these producers in Tuscany, if they're making higher end wines or wines that have the ability to be more age worthy, they'll typically also make something more entry level so you can kind of pop in for it at any time. Another great example of that would be with Brunello di Montalcino, once again, the neighboring village, where you could have a wine called Rosso di Montalcino, which you might have heard of before, which is also the same grape, Sangiovese, but just with the lesser aging requirement. So more kind of like ready to drink now, as opposed to needing some more time to age. So I hope that makes sense. But so with Vino Nobile di Montepulciano, you have aging requirement here of 24 months. And then with the Reserva, which is that top tier level, 36 months minimum aging. So we'll talk about kind of how that goes. With this specific wine, you have an interesting combination of like oak barrels that they're using, because the goal here is aging in oak is an important process typically for a lot of red wines that have the ability to like age a little bit longer. So maybe cellaring or aging the wine for anywhere from like 10, 15, 20 plus years. And not only will like oak aging kind of help like give the wine a little bit more depth and complexity, it also will take tannins are like a big part of red wines. They're in the grape skins, and actually the grape skins are what makes like red wine kind of unique and taste the way it does, because the majority of red grapes, if you just press them, the juice is mostly clear. It's when you take the red skins and let them soak or macerate that you're going to get your color, your structure, your phenolic compounds, all of that good stuff. And then the oak aging will just help kind of create like a cradle or vessel for the wine. It will add secondary flavors or aromas and can also add some more tannin. But the trick is, and this is where I think Italy does a pretty good job, you don't want to overpower the wine with oak barrels. Oak can impart a lot of flavor. The best possible example is if there are any whiskey drinkers here that are bourbon drinkers, all bourbon whiskey is aged in new charred American oak, and it gives you just these really bold, robust flavors, especially a lot of like vanilla, a lot of like spices, coconut, like lots of different things that can come in from oak. And with wine, you want some of those flavors, but you also don't want it to overpower or overshadow the grape varietal from which like you're featuring. And you don't want it to overshadow to the sense of place or the wonderful kind of terroir place from which the wine comes from. So you have to use, definitely you have to be a little more restrained. And the way that winemakers can do that is they can use barrels that are either larger barrels, so you're putting the wine in a bigger barrel so you're not imparting as much surface area of oak, or you can also use barrels that have maybe been used several times. So maybe they're second or third passage barrels that aren't going to impart as much like new oak flavor. The barrels of choice that a lot of Italian winemakers are using, especially in Tuscany, are either French oak, which tends to be really beautiful in terms of giving some like nice aromatic spices, and sometimes like little toasty coconut elements too. And then Slovenian oak, which is coming from neighboring Slovenia and Eastern Europe. And those tend to be bigger barrels as well, that once again aren't there to impart as much flavor as opposed to structure. So that's important. So with this specific wine, the Vino Nobile di Montepulciano from Tenuta di Gratiano, we have 18 months here in French oak. And there's a bunch of different like types of French oak they're using. They're using first passage, second passage, and third passage barrels, and some smaller and some a bit larger. So they're kind of playing around. It's almost like you're kind of doing chemistry and trying to figure out, you know, what exact concoction works well. And then 60% of these large Slovenian oak casks. And I think this makes just a really elegant wine. In my opinion, the Vino Nobile di Montepulciano from Tenuta di Gratiano is one of the best like value wines in Tuscany, and I'd say definitely in Italy. In terms of the aromatics, like what I think people love about Sangiovese, and you can find it in different iterations all around Tuscany, is the fact that you get on the nose a lot of like red fruits. Definitely that dried cherry is one of the things that like always pops out at me for Sangiovese. And in terms of the color too, it just has this beautiful kind of ruby red with a little of these like orange flecks that come through as well. Sangiovese is known for not being a super full-bodied grape. It's usually more in that kind of medium body range. And when I use the word like body, think about like milk, like anywhere from skim milk to whole milk, you know, just kind of right there in the middle. And also too, in terms of tannin, it has like persistent tannins, which have that kind of drying sensation, but they're well integrated and naturally has good acidity. So this is a grape that does have potential to be aged. And then in terms of other things that I'm getting on the nose, I'm gonna give this a little swirl to open it up. My nose, ooh, definitely that like cherry, almost like that like woody cherry that comes through is just so beautiful. Definitely get like a little bit of plum and like wild strawberry notes as well. And on the palate here, once again, too, much drier, like more of those dried cherry and like spice notes, but also has that persistent acidity and those really well balanced tannins. This is a wine that can like definitely open up over time. And if you had decanted this wine or like was able to open it and let it kind of spend a little more time with air, it probably would benefit from that because this wine has structure. It's a wine that actually could be aged for about 10 plus more years, which is pretty cool. It's great when you can find something in that 20-ish range that you can, you know, pop in the cellar and forget about it for a while, but it's also approachable now, which is really wonderful. In terms of pairings too, I definitely go more towards like wild game here, or also to like red meat pairings, especially like that kind of classic like Florentine steak, I think would be really nice. But for the vegetarian people here, which I am usually one of them, I would definitely go with more like red sauce, like maybe based pastas here, eggplant based dishes, maybe like kind of a grilled eggplant dish I think could be really nice, or eggplant parmesan, something along those lines could work well. And I think this could even go well too with some mushroom based dishes too, like portobello mushroom burgers, or something along those lines. Oh, that makes me so happy. Well, I spoke for about 40 minutes, so I want to make sure that you all get to ask some questions in a couple of minutes. But I just wanted to say, like, this is kind of the start of your exploration of Tuscan wines. We only talked about really two, whereas there's so many different wines to explore. So I definitely recommend you come visit us at Gordon's. Your closest location in Waltham will be on 894 Main Street, but we do have a Moody Street location as well. And our Main Street location has a pretty bountiful Italian wine selection, and we have a great staff who can always answer your questions and get you started on your journey, as it is a journey with Italian wine. You're always learning something new. It's always a fun exploration, and you just have to like play along with it and have fun. I'll also mention too with Gordon's, we have, for those of you who are like interested in learning more about wine, through our website, gordonswine.com, we have a daily e-newsletter, which sends out like daily offers on some of the best wines from around the world. And we offer some really great deals from some really interesting wines. And each email that goes out every day has a really cool offer that has like a really well-written, thoughtful, curated explanation, which is always fun to read. As much as I love reading books from the library, I also love reading our Gordon's wine descriptions, because our team just puts so much effort into like researching these wines and really just offering things that we feel like are of high quality and caliber. And then I'll also say too, I started with Gordon's a wine club called Crewbox, spelled CRUBOX. And crewbox.com is our website, and it's a monthly 4-bottle shipment where you can explore some of the world's finest regions and vineyard sites and get the wine delivered right to your home. And I host a monthly Zoom tasting for that. And it's so much fun and a great way to explore if you're looking to kind of start that journey. So I just wanted to really thank Deborah for this opportunity to speak with the Waltham Public Library. It's just been a real pleasure being with you all, and I can't wait to answer some questions and stick around. And I hope you've enjoyed the wines. So I want to thank you so much.
And thank you, Chelsea. That was fantastic. You did a great job explaining the wines. It brought back a lot of memories for me, because we did a bicycling trip in Tuscany a couple of years ago, and really enjoyed the wine there. So a lot of it felt very familiar. We do have several questions, so I wanted to read those to you so that you can answer them. So one viewer says, the naming of Italian wines is confusing.
Yes.
Explain how they're named and how we can understand the labels.
That's a great question. So what's really confusing about Italian wine labels is sometimes they'll put the grape on the front of the label, sometimes they'll put the region on the front of the label, and sometimes they'll put both on the front of the label. So that's very confusing. So it's just really kind of getting to know some of these indigenous grapes and these regions. What I always like to say with Italian wine is maybe start simple and start with one specific region. For example, like if you got to taste the Sangiovese tonight, you enjoyed it, maybe just start to like research Tuscany a little bit more and get to know the wines from the area. And the more you get to know these geographies, the better you can like understand what it is that you're drinking. But just to like decode like a label here together, as I think it's important. If it's a DOCG wine, which we can see here from the seal, it'll typically say either the like specific town or like area which it comes from, or sometimes a combination of the grape and the town. So Vino Nobile is once again like Montepulciano's kind of playful name for Sangiovese there, in addition to Prunola Gentile. It sounds a little easier to pronounce too, as it's a noble wine from the area, and Montepulciano is the town. But there is no indication here on the front of like the grape varietal. You just have to know that like the only grape that's planted in Montepulciano to be called Vino Nobile di Montepulciano is Sangiovese. So it does involve like a level of knowledge there, which is challenging, right? Definitely not easy. Whereas there might be some declassified wines from Tuscany, which just might say Sangiovese and then Toscana down below. So you know the grape, you know where you're tasting from. That makes it easier. And then, for example, with the Vernaccia di San Gimignano, once again, you have the grape here, Vernaccia, even though there are some different other options, which you probably won't see because they're very, very obscure. And di San Gimignano is the village from which it comes from. But just as an example of another kind of classic Italian wine, there's one of my favorite wines from Piedmont is called Barolo. And Barolo is like the town and the township from which the grapes are sourced, but the only grape varietal you can have in Barolo wines is Nebbiolo. So while it doesn't say that on the front of the label, once you kind of get to know these specific geographies, you can kind of get to know what it is that you're dealing with. And that takes a lot of practice. So I like to say start small and go up from there. Maybe start with one region, get to know it a little bit better, and then feel free to explore more. But it can be very confusing. And I still read labels sometimes and I'm like, what am I working with here? It involves a lot of knowledge. And so don't ever feel like you can't just like dive in and have fun with it.
Great advice. One viewer says, because grapes for each wine are grown in such specific regions, how are changing rainfall and temperature patterns from climate change affecting these wines and winemaking and grape growers in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are definitely specific areas in Italy that are being affected by climate change. I would say Tuscany hasn't really had as much of an issue for whatever reason, maybe with more of that maritime climate. But I've noticed the areas that have been most impacted in like Italy have been like Piedmont, which is in the northwest, just like two up from Tuscany. So you have Tuscany, Liguria, and then Piedmont in the northwest. And that's had some issues with like, you know, definitely having a frost at like, you know, weird times of the year. Rain isn't usually as big of a deal. Sometimes it can like water down the wines a little bit. But overall, I think producers have like, you know, figured out, you know, little tips and tricks around that. But I would say that frost is one of the most challenging things that climate change has brought about. And like an early or like, you know, unexpected frost can really especially screw up the wines, especially when they happen in the spring. There was a recent like freak frost incident that happened in Burgundy in eastern France, and that like sent a lot of winemakers into a tizzy. So you're definitely finding some of these cooler areas are having issues with frost. That's coming like more often, and hailstorms too are freak weather incidents. And so they might need to kind of adjust, you know, in terms of from year to year, you know, sometimes knowing that they're going to have less wine to produce in terms of production one year, the next, which changes pricing. But you are definitely seeing some regions too that are starting to maybe plant some varietals that are more suited towards like warmer climates in areas that were more moderate. So it's definitely is changing a bit, and we'll see kind of how it shakes out. But the one interesting thing is for the areas that are more drought prone with climate change, most grapes can do pretty well with very small amounts of water. That's positive in that sense, but it's definitely I'd say the frost and the hail is like the thing that like has been the most challenging for sure.
So it sounds like the unpredictability of the
Yeah, and I think it's crazy because it's like, you know, in a vintage, it's just one day that can ruin the whole vintage. It's crazy. Like, you know, you're at the mercy of like Mother Nature, and that's like a beautiful thing. And with technology now, a lot of winemakers can make a great wine in a challenging vintage. But, you know, Mother Nature throws a lot of curveballs, and it's tricky for sure.
So speaking of Mother Nature, one question that I got is, how has COVID affected the Tuscan wine industry?
Oh gosh. I mean, it's just been so devastating. Like obviously to see, you know, how COVID's affected so many people, but like definitely with the restaurants closing, like, you know, a lot of these, especially more obscure and artisanal Italian wines are such a hand sell. So you don't even find a lot of some of these smaller production wines in a lot of wine shops, unless they're like the small artisanal shops. You know, a lot of big box stores aren't necessarily going to be carrying, you know, a ton of Vernaccia to San Gimignano or Vino Nobile to Montepulciano, because you have to train the staff to like, you know, sell that type of wine. And I feel like restaurants are really, or places like Gordon's where we have like a great staff that's able to do it, are really like where you go to kind of get turned on to these really interesting wines. And with the restaurants being shut down, like there's been a ton of Italian wines that have been put, I think, in jeopardy from that, and you know, not being able to open their doors to like hospitality. I mean, for anybody that's going to be planning a trip to Tuscany after this is all over, the hospitality that you receive in these areas are just like top notch, amazing, and so generous and authentic. And so to lose out on like those experiences and lose out on like a lot of the allocations of where their wines would go has been really challenging. Because of that, we've received a lot of access to wines that would normally be more available to restaurants, because restaurants would be like the first choice, which is like great that we've gotten them. But at the same time, you know, we just want to support these wineries in any way that we can. And I think it's been like quite challenging for a lot of them. It's just like, you know, they're already dealing with a lot. And it's not like a lot of these small wineries are like super profitable. It's a real labor of love here. They're farming at the end of the day. So anything that like, you know, goes amok can really affect them.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question.
Great question.
One viewer says, I am part of an organic wine club. I find that the wines don't last as long. Is that because of the lack of preservatives?
That's a great question. So it's interesting. I wonder if it's I don't know at what wine club. I know that there's one called Dry Farmed Wines, which is like focus on organic wine. And so okay, the thing is that's really complicated with wine these days is there's this like movement that's focused on like natural wine. Which natural wine, basically the idea is that it's like a more hands-off approach to winemaking, kind of letting nature do its thing, not using, you know, oak barrels because that's going to impact the flavors, using techniques such as like indigenous fermentation, where you're using an indigenous yeast as opposed to a doctored yeast. So it's a pretty like craft approach to winemaking. But there's a lot of these like kind of like hipper wineries that have like sprouted out that like are making some wines that are like pretty funky, I would say. And they're using organic viticulture, but to use organic viticulture doesn't mean that like has to sacrifice in how long the wines can age for or last for. If anything, I find that some of these wines, both wines we're featuring today, are from organic vineyards, not certified, because a lot of times in Italy, these smaller wineries do not care to get a certification as they've been, you know, farming this way for 40, 60, 100 plus years. So they don't look at it as like they need to get certified for it. It's like, that's just what they do. So I find that like a lot of these wines that are made with like integrity, quality, sustainable farming, or organic farming actually last for longer. You know, once you open them and pop them back in the fridge, which I do for my whites and red wines, and then I'll take the reds out, you know, when I'm ready to consume them about a half an hour before, is I find that a lot of these like quality wines have just even more longevity. Not only in terms of like aging, if you choose to do that with some specific wines, but in terms of like how long they're able to last. So I wonder if some of the wines that the person who's asking the question had were like organic wines, but they're just like not made at the end of the day, just like super thoughtfully. And they just might not be like as complex or interesting. Because I've seen a lot of that out of the market. As like there's a lot of people who are talking about like, you know, additive free wine. And a lot of times organic wine might be using less sulfites than like non-organic wines, but that doesn't mean that the wine still doesn't have like preservative qualities, as there's other alternatives you can use to sulfites, such as like a little more CO2 or tannin, actually, which is in a lot of most red grapes, is also a natural preservative too. So there's other kind of combos that you can do.
Got it. Okay. This viewer says, fantastic presentation and tasting. We sampled the wines right along with you. So enjoyable, and we will be purchasing these wines again. Thank you so much.
Oh, I'm so glad you enjoyed it. It's honestly, it's always so fun. I love to choose wines that I want to drink myself. And so I always love it when people enjoy them. That makes me joyful.
Yes. Another person says, such a fun program, and thank you for sharing your time and expertise, Chelsea. And another person says, wonderful presentation. Chelsea is so knowledgeable and has a lovely, relaxed presentation style. We learned a lot.
That makes me so happy. I love sharing Italian wine with people. It's literally one of my favorite things to do. So this was just like an absolute dream for me. So I'm glad that people have enjoyed.
Yeah. So happy audience. I do have a couple more questions for you. One is, how do Napa wines compare in quality and price with Tuscan wines?
Ooh, that's a great question. So Napa has to the kind of the king and queen, I'd say, of Napa is Cabernet Sauvignon is going to be pretty predominant in terms of like plantings in Napa. And then Sauvignon Blanc tends to be one of the most popular white varietals planted. So in Napa, it's a little bit of a warmer climate than Tuscany. maybe as you work your way inland, Tuscany, it's a little bit more similar, but especially at the maritime kind of level and where Bulgari is on the coast in Livorno, that's cooler, as I mentioned, a little more similar to Bordeaux. I'd say that the wines in Napa are more expensive. Even entry level wines in Napa these days are like incredibly expensive, and they're great. Like there's wonderful wines from Napa, but I'd say with Tuscany, like, Brunello di Montalcino is expensive. Some of the super Tuscans can get pretty expensive, but overall, it's not like you can find some amazing value kind of all around, and especially for the white wines too. Like Vernaccia di San Gimignano, if you find one over $30, I'd be shocked. It's just these wines should be reasonable and great. But in Napa, I'd say the prices are usually much higher. The wines are bigger and bolder for the red wines. Like Cabernet Sauvignon is naturally a more powerful grape varietal than Sangiovese. And then the other grapes that you might find in Napa, such as like Merlot and like Zinfandel and grapes as such, still also have like a little bit more fruit. The fruit's overall like riper. The oak tends to be like more American barrels that they're using, which give you like more of that like oak flavor. So there are some comparisons to be made between like Napa and Tuscany, but I'd overall say that Tuscany is just a little bit more refined and Napa's like a little bit more fruit forward and powerful, but both great. Property values in Napa though have gotten to the point where they're almost more expensive than like just about anything. Like, I mean, I remember I used to find wines in Napa like under $20, and it's hard to find a Napa Valley wine these days that's under $35. And like at that quality, I feel like sometimes you can get stuff a little bit better in Tuscany at that value. But that being said, if anybody pours me an Napa wine, I will never say no.
Great. Well, we're actually at the end of our time, so I want to thank you again. I thought your presentation was fantastic, and as you can see, a lot of people enjoyed it also. So thank you all for tuning in tonight, and I hope you have a good night. I am now going to enjoy my wine from our selection tonight, and thank you very much. Good
Awesome.
night.
Thank you. It was so much fun. I can't wait to have to do it again soon, for sure.
Okay, we are off the